The more power you have and the more integrated trauma you have, the more damage you do to other people. And you could trace back every systemic problem in our country comes from people with power that are emotionally and psychologically and spiritually damaged and haven't done the work. Every problem comes from there.
Welcome to the Horizon Lab podcast. Today, we are welcoming Justin Foster, the co-founder of Massive. Massive is a company that is absolutely revolutionizing the space around leadership and brand strategy. Justin combines philosophy, brand poetry, and strategic coaching to help leaders create memorable brands. So, without further ado, let's welcome Justin. Hey, Justin, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Austin. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely, man. So you've had a really fascinating life journey from growing up on a cattle ranch in Oregon, becoming an author, brand strategist, and a speaker. Can you take us back to those early years? What were some of those moments that really shaped you and who you are today?
Well, I've had a very odd journey, to be honest with you. Most people don't grow up on ranches anymore. Most people don't grow up in a Christian fundamentalist cult. Sadly, some of us still grow up in abusive homes. And those three factors really shaped my journey. And people that are listening are also survivors of like childhood abuse. One of the things that we don't really develop is we don't know who we are. Because of the abuse, we don't know who we are. So we have to kind of craft our own self in the way. And a lot of it is like to get the hell out of here, like to not be in this anymore. And the ranch life was awesome though. It was the cowboy life, and I really love that part of it. And that shaped me around like work ethic and appreciation for nature, survivor skills. I can't imagine going through the other two aspects of what I went through without the ranching. The ranch is kind of a oasis away from that because that side of the family wasn't involved in the cult. They weren't abusive. It was at home and another side of the family. And, I got married very young, which is not uncommon for people that grow up in violence and Christian fundamentalism, and had my first son, Logan, when I was 22. And I spent like 20 years really just kind of surviving. I ran on a lot of resentment. I didn't know how to frame what happened to me in a healthy way. And in 2014, I had what would best be called a spiritual awakening. And that led to an entirely new trajectory until I had another one, which led to another new trajectory. And, that's how I got here. I didn't set out to become a brand strategist or an author or speaker. Those were all kind of cosmic accidents, honestly.
Interesting. So if you don't mind, of course, you don't have to do this, but can you tell us a little bit about this Christian cult and what was happening to you?
Yeah, so, I don't know what else to call it other than a cult. It wasn't a cult in the sense of like Scientology or you hear about some other Christian type cults like that are out there that there's a guru and there's there's like one person in charge. But it was a cult in many ways. And so it takes a little bit of context to understand that American Christianity has a fundamentalist sect to it, not unlike Islam does. Theirs is manifested in physical terrorism, and Christian fundamentalism is manifested in religious terrorism. And it's what I call the piece of shit doctrine. And it's that there's something wrong with you and you're defective and you're born defective and you need a savior. And the way that we're in, this church that we're in, is the only way on earth. And if you leave it, not only are you going to hell, you are also going to be miserable the rest of your life. And it's so deeply ingrained in you that it shapes your entire lens of the world. But there was always, this is one thing that's been with me my whole life, Austin, is this sort of outlaw side of me. And where I questioned it and I was kind of a rebel within the organization in many ways. And there was just something always sort of off. But I go back to what I said earlier. When you don't know who you are, you try to find an identity. It was an identity. It was a way to say, I'm part of this group. I'm married to this person. I do this job. And when I started to unravel those things, it was then, I realized that this was a form of religious abuse. I am priceless and whole, and there's nothing wrong with me. And, I do dumb shit sometimes, and once that spell was broken, I could really see how harmful that doctrine was. And I'd have to get into like a lot of detail, but it's just like very isolating, very much around like, the only book that you were encouraged to read was the Bible. We couldn't have TVs. They discouraged even listening to other music or having a radio, very, very strict and very, very very much based off like fear of disappointing God. So I remember I've had migraines my whole life, and I would have a migraine. I was a little kid, and I believed that I'd done something wrong and I was being punished. So that's how ingrained it was in you, that there was this angry God that you had done. And so it's sort of like karma in a way. I don't believe any of that anymore, but it certainly was a huge influence on me for a number of years, not in a good way. The only good thing I got out of Austin is that I am really fucking good at Bible trivia now.
Okay. And so how has that changed how you view the world today? What has that caused you to evolve and grow in what ways?
Well, I believe that we are all now inherently priceless, and that there's a part of us that Carl Jung and Thomas More and other psychologists talk about, of the core self, and that most of us don't do the inner work. We're told who we are, and if it makes us feel safe and stable, then we keep doing that. But our soul kind of atrophies. I'm not a Buddhist, but I use a Buddhist term of a namaste view of the world. And this definitely applies to how I operate as a business owner and as a marketer and as a brand strategist, which is the namaste is the divine in me sees the divine in you. And another way I like to say it is I see souls before roles. So we all have labels. We see somebody and we assume that they're this or that based off of all the various social labels. And certainly those social labels have relevance, but they're not who someone is at the core. And so that's been a huge shift for me over the last 20 years of seeing people as they are, not as I assume them to be or project them to be, or nor do I see through their projection too. So this serves me extremely well in branding and marketing. I can understand energy, the energy somebody puts out into the world. That kind of intuition has been also a very useful tool for understanding humans at a deeper level, because marketing is typically, especially now with all the algorithm shit, to the front of the mind, like conscious mind stuff, and it's used to manipulate emotions in order to create behavior. Well, that's cruel to do that to other people. So if you actually believe in your own value and you believe in the concept of namaste or the golden rule, you would apply it to marketing too. You'd say, well, don't market unto others the way you don't want to be marketed to. So it's all kind of interwoven now into this sense of like what I refer to as just conscious living. So it's in my relationship with my partner, my sons, my friends, my business partners, my clients, and it's all integrated. They're just one me that just manifested in different ways depending on what I'm doing.
So you talked about seeing people as they are.
Mm-hmm.
How do you do that? What was the main shift of taking out your perception, and what techniques do you use to try to see people as they are?
That's a great question. So it's understanding that we are basically three-dimensional creatures. We have a reptilian brain that's related to, heat sensitivity and sex drive, and it's got the reticular activating system that helps us remember where food is and, impulse type stuff. And then we have the nervous system of a mammal, and it's a very sophisticated one, very similar to horses, and which is why horses are great at therapy, equine therapy. But we also have a neocortex. And this is the problem, is that the neocortex is a storyteller, a label maker and a storyteller. So if you don't live a contemplative life, if you haven't done the inner work, whether that's trauma integration, spiritual contemplation, if you haven't gone into your heart and soul, you're going to present to the world. And well, there are markers of presenting what I call the hologram to the world. And we all do it. We all do it because, I don't know you. So I'm aware that I'm on a podcast. So I brought my A game and I make sure I got my shit together here. There's a difference between putting your best face on and living in a hologram, and they're indicators. So I can generally tell if someone doesn't really know who they are. Especially, and this is, it's funny to bring race into it, especially white people. White people that don't know who they are talk about their stuff and their plans, and they gossip. And that's true in business. It's true if we at a neighborhood party. And so it's sort of surfacey type stuff. And you see that in the business world too, where they're talking about like their numbers from last quarter or something, which isn't bad. It's just like, who gives a shit? I want to know who you are as a person underneath all that. A lot of it's energy. There's a kind of a thinness to someone's personality sometimes when they haven't done that inner work. And I'm not judging at all. It's just something that I'm aware of. And it's this thing that people do because, like in the United States in particular, like the worst thing you can be is sad and poor. And so we put on a costume of being Instagram shiny in many ways. And if you've done the inner work, and every person that has some level of consciousness that's done inner work can see through that shit. The difference is like, are we judging people? Because we've been there too. We still go back sometimes. Are we judging people, or are we extending compassion and kindness to them? And what doesn't change for me is there's still a soul. It's still the namaste. There's still a divine in you, a divine in me, and that's who I want to relate to. But sometimes that layer that people have is very, very, very thick with, especially if they have money and power. It's very thick and very hard to get to.
So, what are some techniques people can do to find their inner self and work on their inner self?
Well, that's a great question. Is first of all, you have to remove or set aside a pathological view of yourself. They use the language of, well, I'm not good at this, or I'm bad at this, or I'm terrible at time management, or whatever. Any of this, like, it's not just about, I hate toxic positivity. It's the understanding that if you treat yourself as a problem to solve, our neocortex, our super smart brain, is going to find problems to solve. It'll keep feeding problems. And that's where you get people that are never really satisfied with who they are. And so that's the first step, is you have to realize that I don't have a problem to solve. I have a puzzle to solve. And the second thing is to look at all of your emotions as messages. So, and I say emotions, feelings, so they could be a combo. Like anxiety is kind of a combo thing between sensory anxiety and emotional anxiety, or depression, or anger, or resentment, and be really, really honest about how you feel. If you can be really honest about how you feel, this is what journaling is good for, or meditation, then you can get curious about it. And here's a beautiful thing about the way we're designed as humans. Curiosity and anxiety, let's say, cannot coexist at the same time. They can't coexist in the same moment at the same time. So if you're anxious and you're like, oh, I wonder why. Why is that? Or what's causing that? That's so empowering. And I'll tell you a quick, very brief story about this. I was coaching someone about this very topic, and he was like, how do I do that? I don't understand, and I don't believe, like, there's just me. And I'm like, okay, shut your eyes. And what are you thinking about right now? And I'm thinking about this, this, and this. What are you feeling right now? Like emotionally? Oh, this, and this. What are your sensations in your body? This, and this. I said, okay, who is making those observations? And he was like, holy shit. And it's what I call the epiphany. There's this moment that you are not your thoughts and feelings. You have thoughts and feelings, but there's another, as Carl Jung and others said, there's an I and a me. And the I is who you really are, and the me is how you're sort of operating in the world. And most people never make that separation. If you can be really honest about what you're feeling and start to see a little bit of separation, now you're in curiosity and observation mode. And even getting to there is going to put you in a space that probably less than 1% of Americans in particular find themselves, of realizing they're not their thoughts and feelings. Feelings are just messages, being curious. And then the last thing is being honest about trauma. Now, this is a word we throw around a lot. And really, most of the time, honestly, we mean drama. Trauma is a medical thing. It's damage to the nervous system. And if you've had trauma as an adult, that needs to be treated different than trauma as a child. And one of the very best things you can do if you had trauma as a child, and you should really get professional help, go to a therapist and all that. But the thing you can do yourself is something called reparenting. Many of the emotions we feel as an adult are just unresolved from our childhood. Like we never got to express them. So they show up in different ways. Well, unless you're just a raging asshole, you wouldn't talk shit to a child that shows up and says, I'm scared, or I'm lonely, or whatever they're feeling. You'd sit with them and help them get curious about why they feel that way. And then what you're doing is if you had childhood trauma, you're giving yourself what you didn't get then, which is a tremendous gift to yourself. Now, if you didn't have childhood trauma, you don't necessarily need to go through that step, reparenting or inner child work or anything like that. But if you did have childhood trauma, it's an essential step.
Do you find that a lot of people make their job or their business part of their identity, even though it might not be that way?
Yes. It's a very wise observation on your part. Yes, I'm borrowing this sort of concept from a dear friend of mine, Kelly Campbell, who has written a book on trauma-informed leadership. And in her research for writing the book, she arrived at the same conclusion I have, that most people seek leadership positions because of unintegrated childhood trauma. They're trying to get to a place of power so they don't have to deal with their shit. Sadly, that produces abusive, narcissistic, even unintentionally narcissistic and abusive leaders. We see that rampantly in our country today. Then what happens, though, is that when the ego mind, which is kind of the me mind, attaches a job or a role to an identity, and this happens, some people over-identify being a dad or a mom, or they over-identify with their sexual orientation or their ethnicity or whatever, and it's an over-identification to a thing. When your ego mind attaches to that, it's very, very difficult to unattach it, because your mind will treat that as a threat, and your whole nervous system will respond to it as if you've been threatened. So you look at it like road rage. Road rage is the identity that I'm a good driver, and that was unfair, and it was a personal attack on me, and therefore road rage. And there's a million examples of this. Well, it happens in business all of the time. And this is the sequence here, Austin. The more power you have, which could be titled power, or, like you're a CEO or something, or money or authority, the more power you have and the more integrated trauma you have, the more damage you do to other people. And you could trace back every systemic problem in our country comes from people with power that are emotionally and psychologically and spiritually damaged and haven't done the work. Every problem comes from there.
Interesting. Earlier on, you mentioned that you had 2 spiritual awakenings, possibly more. I don't know. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I won't get into necessarily the details because it's a longer story, but I will put it as kind of a framework that I've realized that I think is fairly common when I've talked to other people. And the first spiritual awakening that I had, and I've talked to many others have had, is an awareness of your power. Like, oh, wait a minute, I actually have worth and power. And Viktor Frankl writes about this in Man's Search for Meaning. Nelson Mandela talked about it in his writings. Others have too. Is that there's a part of you that my partner Virginia, who's a Latina, the Spanish word for it she uses is indomable, which basically means indomitable or unbreakable. So you find a part of yourself that was not harmed by what happened to you. And you're like, holy shit, if that's true, what else is true? And if that's true, what else is not true that I was told about who I am? So it's why I have a tattoo on my arm here that says the mission is in the suffering. It's when you realize like there's an unbreakable part of you, and what happened to you is going to guide you in a healthy way into what you're going to do with your life after this epiphany, this first awakening. The second one is related to a kind of self-love or self-compassion. And it is, again, loving, to quote Jesus, loving yourself, loving your neighbor as yourself. So loving yourself with unconditional love, which unconditional love is the 100% commitment to another person's well-being. In this case, your own. So well-being produces good decisions about health, good decisions about boundaries, good decisions about how much shit you put up with. And those all come first from self-compassion. And that was the second awakening that I had, of saying, basically the first one was saying yes to a bunch of things, and the next one was saying no to a bunch of things. And I think there's probably a third one based off older people that I've talked to that do a lot of this inner work. And it's similar to Maslow's hierarchy of self-actualization, but I haven't experienced it fully yet. So I don't know what it is, but I think I'm 54. So hopefully I have time.
That's cool. So you still have places to grow.
Oh, hell yeah. Every day.
I think we all do, right?
I hope so. I mean, Michelangelo's last words were, I still have so much left to learn. It's beautiful.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I feel kind of bad because we didn't really talk much about what you do in your business. So can you give us a brief overview of what you do?
Yeah, I own multiple businesses, but the center of it is really a brand strategist or CMO, but I'm like a CMO for the soul, meaning if you're a solo entrepreneur, or you're a small business owner, you're a big giant corporation, but you're not, corrupt. I help you express what's inside of you either personally or your organization as your brand. And that manifests in what I call an ethos, which is a school of philosophy, like how you think, brand poetry, which is how you communicate, and spiritual experience, which is how other people experience your brand, especially your customers and your employees. And I do that often as a fractional CMO. Not always. Sometimes I do it as a short-term kind of coaching gig, but it's taking all of these various tools tools and ideas and bringing them to bear with the understanding that it's no coincidence that the world's oldest and most famous brands were mystics, were spiritual. The Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad, Rumi, you go on down the line. And, we're going to be talking about Gandhi 1,000 years from now if we're still around. Well, there's lessons to learn there, is that the goal is to be relevant and good in the world. Let's learn those lessons and apply them to our brands and how we behave as a leader, how we want our people to feel, how we want our customers to feel. And at the end, understanding that if you see the divine in your customers, they'll see the divine in you and they'll treat you right, like Patagonia has learned.
Wow. And if anybody wanted to work with you, where would they be able to find you?
I'm very findable on social media. I can go to my LinkedIn, just look for Justin Foster, or go to massivechange.co, or we didn't really talk about my other business, but you can also go to thefractionalexo.com. But to work with me directly, massivechange.co.
Beautiful, beautiful. And I always end the podcast with a fun question. So
yeah.
I heard you're a really big coffee fan and you love country music. So if you could have a coffee with any country music legend, who would it be?
I think I would sit down and have a coffee with Johnny Cash.
That'd be fun.
There's others. Waylon Jennings would be awesome. Willie Nelson would be awesome. Chris Christopherson.
Yeah.
But I feel like Johnny and I, he once said, there's John and there's Johnny and they fight. And, he sang that cover of the Nine Inch Nails song, Hurt,
Yeah.
One of his
last songs, yeah.
Yeah, one of his last songs. And I feel like we would have a rich and beautiful conversation. And what I love most about him is he was the master of the fuck you to power. If people are listening to this, is look up the story of him singing in the White House for Nixon. It's one of the best, outlaw, badass, fuck yous to, a corrupt person. And it's fantastic. And so I find him inspiring in that way.
Wow, that's cool. Well, thank you, Justin. I really appreciate having you on the podcast.
Thank you, Austin. Thanks for the great questions.
Absolutely.